Baptiste home site. If there was one leader of the Underground Railroad in Detroit, there wasn't. But if there was, it's George the Baptiste. Or you could argue William Lambert and him are about equal. But George the Baptiste and William Lambert, and we're at the George the Baptiste home site. He was at that meeting when Frederick Douglass and John Brown met. And his idea was, yeah, John Brown, I hear what you're saying, but let's go down south and blow up institutions that are run by these slave owners. That's what we need to do. So he was going to buy a lot of gunpowder, and they were supposed to go down south secretly and blow up white churches, white slave owner big houses, plantation homes. That was the plan that he had. Of course, you know, everybody didn't buy into that plan, but that was his plan. So he was a longtime Mason and one of Detroit's most active and impassioned black community leaders. He lived here during the 1850s and 60s. He was born in Virginia about 1815. He moved to Madison, Indiana, and became involved in the Underground Railroad. They put a hit out on him. The slave owners were going to kill him because he was such an abolitionist. They put a hit out on him. He had to leave and come to Detroit.
Now, was he French or?
The Baptiste is not French, no. He's a black man. He's not French.
Where did you get that name? Yeah, where'd he get that name from?
His name, no doubt, comes from one of his ancestors who probably was enslaved by a Frenchman. So he himself was not, but no doubt one of his ancestors probably was. So he went to the White House. He worked in the White House. After working in the White House, he came to Detroit, had several successful businesses. He was a delegate to the Cleveland National Convention of Colored Citizens. He was an agent for the Freedmen's Aid Commission. During the Civil War, he was an organizer in Michigan's Colored Regiment. He died in 1875. His house was right here. And he also, if you made it to his house on the Underground Railroad, this was your last spot, he had his own boat called the T. Whitney. And he also had a paid oarsman who would oar you over to Canada. Cadillac's arrival, 2001, this monument was dedicated. It was sculpted by Ed Dwight, who had been an astronaut. He was a black man who was an astronaut. But because of the racism in the NASA program, he left NASA and began to do what he really loved, which was sculpting. So Ed Dwight has done a number of sculptures dealing with the Underground Railroad and slavery. The first one he did is in Battle Creek, Michigan. They have an Underground Railroad monument sitting right next to the Kellogg Foundation in the old William K. Kellogg, W.K. Kellogg house. There's a monument there. It looks very similar to this one, but it's an Underground Railroad monument because Battle Creek was an important station on the Underground Railroad. So he does this one. This one's get dedicated in 2001. And it's a family. So you got the granddad, you got the children here, grandma's over there, mama's here. There's the dad right there, and I think she has another kid with her. And then who's pointing over to freedom? That's George the Baptiste. So we already went to his home site. He was if you made it George the Baptiste, that's your last spot before you on your way to Canada. Because he had a boat called the T. Whitney. He had a paid oarsman who would row you over to Canada to freedom. So that's George the Baptiste pointing the way to freedom. Let's go around to the front and see. Lanterns are thought by some historians to be symbols for the Underground Railroad. So lanterns would be hung outside of windows. At least some historians they're not sure, but they're alleging that may have been a possibility. That lanterns would be hung outside of windows to let people know that this house is a safe house, a station on the Underground Railroad. And in some cases, some people are alleged that quilting, African-American quilts were hung out to let people know. So there are all kinds of allegations. We're not sure if they're all true or not, but this monument points to some of them. So some of the symbols you see on there are symbols that have been found on many of the quilts, African-American quilts in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And then, of course, the lantern here. So this is called the Gateway to Freedom exhibit. We know that Detroit was an important station on the Underground Railroad. Its code name was Midnight because you were almost at freedom, almost at daybreak. Freedom is daybreak. So you're almost there. So its code name was Midnight. And flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars. So, sounds like nonsense. But basically what it's saying is, flying geese stay on the drunkard's path and follow the stars means you can't stay long here in Detroit. Slave catchers are around. You need to go to Canada because the slave catchers are around. So you got to stay on the path and follow the stars. The stars is North Star. You're going north. Which sadly, I mean not sadly, but ironically, Canada's actually south of Detroit. But, oh, excuse me, you could. And then the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on the Bear Paws Trail. And so you would say that. That's another statement basically saying you need to make it to Canada. Detroit is not safe right now.
The monkey wrench turns the wagon.
The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on the Bear Paws Trail. Yeah. So it sounds like nonsense. Are you saying that nobody would know what the heck you're talking about? These are some of the people that's important. Let's talk about some of these people. So you got Reverend W. Anderson, Reverend S.A. Berry, Henry Bibb, who lived in Canada. This black man who would help black people who escaped from Detroit and made it to Canada, helped them organize in Canada their own self-sufficient communities. Also had a abolitionist newspaper. So that's Henry Bibb. Reverend Anthony Binga Jr., Reverend Anthony Binga Sr., Thornton, and Ruthie Blackburn. Ruthie changes her name after she's free to Lucy Blackburn. She didn't want to keep that slave name. So she changed her name to Lucy Blackburn. John Brown, we know he came to Detroit. John M. Brown, who I don't know. Reverend Supply Chase. Shubel Conant, where Conant Gardens come from and the street Conant comes from. He was a Detroit alderman who was an abolitionist, white man who was an abolitionist, and refused to set up a racial restrictive covenant for his land that he owned, which means black people could live there. So that was one little small area of Detroit outside of Black Bottom that black people could live because
which brought Conant Gardens.
That's how Conant Gardens became a place. That's right. So Shubel Conant, Captain Thomas Chilver, Reverend Charles Davey, Reverend Samuel Davis, George the Baptiste. You know him. Alexander Duncan, Joseph Ferguson, Seymour Finney. We know his barn.
Yeah.
Reverend Foote, Mr. and Mrs. George French. We know Mrs. George French's real name is Caroline. She was one of the leaders of the freedom of Thornton and Ruthie Blackburn, the uprising in 1833. Daddy Grace, Shields Green, Horace Hatlock, Laura Haviland. Laura Haviland was in Adrian, Michigan based, and she started the first integrated school in Michigan. She started out as being a Quaker, but the Quakers were pacifists, and she couldn't deal with that. Her work on the Underground Railroad, she believed she had to be armed, so she left the Quaker church. Erastus Hussey ran the Underground Railroad spot in Battle Creek, Michigan, where the other monument is. That's Erastus Hussey and his wife Sarah. Reverend William King, Mr. and Mrs. William Lambert. I told you about William Lambert. His wife was, William Lambert's wife was George French's daughter. Okay. So Caroline and George French had a daughter that was married to William Lambert. Reverend Lent, Abram Lewis, Mr. and Mrs. Madison Lightfoot. We know Mrs. and Madison Lightfoot. Her name is Tabitha. She went with Caroline French to visit Ruthie Blackburn and walked out with her. Charles Monroe, that was the minister, the first minister of Second Baptist Church. Sleepy Polly drove the wagon. He was the person that John Cook paid for to drive the wagon to take Thornton and Ruthie Blackburn to the river. That's who that is, Sleepy Polly. Reverend William Troy, William Webb, Frederick Douglass and John Brown met at William Webb's house, Benjamin Willoughby. That first meeting of the 13 people was at Benjamin Willoughby's house. All right? So, George French home was the site. George French's home was the site of Second Baptist Church organizational meeting. That's Caroline French and George French's house. Second Baptist Church, the first one, is 1839 to 1854, it burned down. And then the second one is 1854 to 1857. And it expanded. Colored Methodist Society. Bethel AME Church is now on St. Antoine and Warren, but they started in the area we know as Black Bottom, and they also were an organization fighting against slavery and part of the Underground Railroad. St. Matthew's Protestant Episcopal Church is one of the churches that comes out of Second Baptist. The first minister of St. Matthew's is the first minister of Second Baptist. He would leave Second Baptist and become the pastor of St. Matthew's. We went to Finney Barnes site. The landing for ferry to Canada was at 2nd and Atwater. We didn't go there. The landing for the steamboat to Canada was at Griswater, Atwater. We almost are there. It's basically where the Princess is. That was a steamboat that took people over to Canada. The landing for ferry to Canada is at Randolph and Atwater. That's that way. George Baptiste home, we went there. William Webb home, we went there. The First Congregational Church of Detroit used to be down here. It is now on Woodward and Forest. And they have an Underground Railroad experience in their basement. So if you ever visit that, you can. It's a good sight to see. And this is one of the trails. The most important trail of the Underground Railroad going to Canada was this one. It's called the Michigan Central Trail. It's really an old Indian trail that black people followed, and now you know it is I-94. But Canada was racist. It wasn't slavery, but it was still racist. So black people had to build self-sufficient communities where they had to produce all the things they needed for themselves. And so there's a number. One's the Dawn Settlement, one is Dresden. One of them is where Uncle Tom's cabin is. Josiah Henson makes it to Uncle Tom is based on a real person named Josiah Henson, and he makes it to Canada and basically sets up a self-sufficient community. As a farm, there's a little school there. They're making things out of wood and selling them. So it's a self-sufficient community. This is what they had to do because they were being discriminated against by people in Canada. So they had to create everything for themselves.
Right.
They had to be self-sufficient, grow their own food, produce stuff that they could sell, make money. You know, because you may not get a job, you may not get hired. So this is what they did. So even though they got free, that not like the, you know,
partially free.
right.
More free, but
so Thornton Blackburn and Ruthie started a company. That's how they made it. Had they had to depend on trying to go to work for somebody, their story would have been a lot different.
Right. Yeah. But to the indigenous people has always been here, right?
That's right. So yeah, that's right.
They making deals with the French and all that. Right. So that's when that French and Indian war come about.
Right. That's right.
Treaties and all that.
On Belle Isle.
So you see,
right?
That point on Belle Isle, that part of it's called Point something. They used to cross right over there.
Yeah, there are a number of people who know. I don't know the spot. Know the spot that. Some black people escaped to Belle Isle and then came from Belle Isle to Canada. Yeah, I don't know where that spot is, but Kim Simmons does that tour. I don't know if she still does it, but she used to be the president of the Black Historic Sites Committee. Okay. And she now runs something called the Detroit River Project. And I know she's been working on a book for some years. So that kind of, I know she kind of put her tour to the back burner working on the book. But she knows that spot. That's not something I know about, but I do plan on talking to her so I can kind of get more information about it. You can see that Canada has their festival at the same time that Detroit has theirs. And then they do the fireworks, the international fireworks on both of them.
Now, is it true that you're working on a book, or was it a movie, or?
Oh, it's a book. For me, it's a book. Yeah, it's called Black. It's called Black Before Bankruptcy. The most important sites in the building of Black Detroit. So that's what it is. So it's not going to be like a chronological history starting from 1701 to 1974. It's going to be particular sites, some of which we've seen today. Particular sites and what happened at those sites and who were the people involved at those particular important historic sites. And so it's a story of places and the people and events involved with those places.
Okay.
And so it'll start.
That sounds really similar to the tour.
Yeah, but it's not going to be just Underground Railroad. That's the difference. Okay. It'll be Yeah, Underground Railroad will be included, but so will the rebellions and riots, so-called riots. So will the marches for civil rights, and so a lot of other stuff will be in there besides just the Underground Railroad.
Okay.
But yeah, the Underground Railroad, the Nation of Islam's founding, all of that will be in there. The Republic of New Africa, Malcolm X giving 3 major speeches in Detroit. Message to the Grassroots, Ballad of the Bullet, and The Last Message, which was done at Hart Plaza at Ford Auditorium, which no longer exists. But he gave that speech 1 week before he was assassinated. So those kind of things were happening. Oh, he was in RNA, okay. Wow. So the shootout in New Bethel in '69 was a major part of Detroit history.
The place after my father pulled me out of it.
Wow.
Yes, right there on Cadillac and Mack.
Wow. They did have a place there. That's right. They did. Well, I need to talk to you.
So we look right.
It was run by Labamba.
Yeah, that's right. By Chokwe Lumumba. Yeah.
So you have a chapter in his upcoming book.
Provisional Government for the Republic of New Africa. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's good. So that's the count. So it's gonna cover all the way up to 1974. So Coleman Young's election is the end of my book. It could be the beginning of another one, but that's the end of that one.
So when should we look forward to it?
You should be looking forward to it next year.
Next year sometime? Okay.
You're going to put out on your next tour.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.